Now, the 20th of June marks the World Refugee Day, a day set aside by the UNHCR to honor the resilience of people displaced by conflict. Now, due to war and conflict, 68 million people were displaced globally last year. The UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres is urging governments to show solidarity by taking action to support refugees. Many European countries and the US have been criticized for their harsh asylum policies. To find a solution to the ongoing migration crisis, the European Commission will hold an informal meeting of European Union leaders in Brussels this weekend. Let's get you more now on the World Refugee Day. I'm joined live from New York by UN correspondent Liling Tan. Liling, just how is the UN marking the World Refugee Day this year?
Primarily by focusing on that 68.5 million displaced people that you were just talking about. That figure averages out to about one person displaced every 2 seconds. And the United Nations is really kind of bringing a lot of the attention on these new figures that have just come out. Now, also the UN High Commissioner for Refugees is marking the occasion by traveling to Niger, where he is right now, from Libya, from which he had been traveling with 122 refugees, mostly women and children from countries such as Somalia and Eritrea. They had arrived in Libya and were being held in detention centers, and now they are, so to speak, being evacuated to Niger. The hope is to resettle these refugees under an international program that focuses primarily on the extremely vulnerable, the most vulnerable people within the global displaced population. Now, the UN has also marked the occasion, as it does every year, by releasing its annual report on global trends in forced displacement. That is, it looks at how many people are displaced by conflict, how many of them have fled countries, how many of them have sought refuge in shelters and refugee camps across the border in neighboring countries. And that's where we got that 68.5 million figure from. Now, the report attributed a lot of the spike in the numbers of displaced people to protracted conflicts, long-standing unresolved conflicts, as well as new emergent crises like what we saw last year erupt out of Rakhine State in Myanmar. So a lot of that focus has been on these vulnerable people, and the UN Secretary-General himself had called for more compassion, for more action and solidarity among the international community to kind of drive the focus back to not just providing relief and supporting the refugees, but also to look at the root causes of these crises.
Well, millions of people are displaced across the world. As you mentioned, there are 68.5 million. South Sudan, the DRC, Yemen, Syria, the list goes on. So what is the state of the world when it comes to refugees?
It's still a crisis and an acute one. Now, you mentioned a lot of these countries, including South Sudan and Syria. These two countries were among the top countries of origins that were driving the largest, that have driven the largest refugee population, the largest number of refugees across borders into neighboring countries, and some as far away as Europe and the United States. Now, well, these are two of the major contributors. We also had a new addition, the mass exodus from Myanmar's Rakhine State of mostly Rohingya refugees. That number rose from about 500,000 at the beginning of 2017 to 1.2 million at the end of the year. And on South Sudan, we did see a 1 million increase in the number of refugees fleeing civil war and conflict there. And in Syria, the number now stands at 6.3 million, which was a 14% spike increase over the previous year, over 2016. So this is really a global issue. The refugee issue is made even worse by what we're seeing out of some wealthier Western nations, in which there's a lot more pressure to close the borders to reduce the influx of refugees.
Well, it is a global issue there, Liling, and we are seeing Europe acting the way it is, trying to stem the tide of migration as well, closing down its borders. Is there enough global will, though, to stop the fighting in crisis areas and to actually address the root causes of displacement?
Now, broadly speaking, there is a will, and there has been over the past few years when that refugee crisis first really came to the forefront a couple of years ago in 2015. So many nations, in fact, the United Nations member states unanimously adopted the New York Declaration 2 years ago. And that really gave a sense of a commitment by countries in principle to try and mitigate and ease this crisis. However, as you've mentioned, the Europe situation, in the US, we're also seeing similar things play out here. What's happening across the Mexico-Texas border, where children are being separated from their families, a lot of backlash over that. So people say if there's a will, there's a way, but yes, there is a will. The execution of it remains wanting, and the UN's $8 billion funding appeal for this year to help refugees has only been 14% met.
All right, Liling Tan joining us there from New York. Thank you.